Isidor Blumenfeld, better known as Kid Cann, was a Romanian-born Jewish-American crime enforcer who operated in Minneapolis, Minnesota for over 40 years. He remains Minnesota's most notorious mobster, linked to several high-profile crimes in the city's history. In 1924, he was tried and acquitted for the murder of cab driver Charles Goldberg. Kid Cann was also at the scene when Vern Miller attempted to kill Minneapolis police officer James Trepanier. He faced trial again for personally firing a Thompson submachine gun in the infamous December 1935 contract killing of investigative journalist Walter Liggett, but was acquitted. In the early 1950s, Blumenfeld faced federal charges for conspiracy and racketeering during the hostile takeover and dismantling of the Twin City rapid transit streetcar system, but he was never convicted. However, he wasn't always so lucky. He was convicted of violating the Federal Mann Act in 1959 and of attempted jury tampering in 1961. After a short prison stint, he retired to Miami Beach, Florida, where he partnered with Meyer Lansky to build a real estate empire. Despite his retirement, Kid Cann remained involved in organized crime until his death, leaving behind an estimated $10 million fortune. During Prohibition, Kid Cann and his brothers Harry and Jacob, also known as Dandy and Yiddy Bloom, evolved from small-time criminals to major figures in organized crime, with ties to the American Mafia. By the time Kid Cann was 26, the Blumenfeld brothers controlled a significant portion of Minneapolis's criminal underworld, overseeing bootlegging, illegal gambling, prostitution, extortion, and labor racketeering. Author Neil Carlin described their organization as led by the Kid on machine guns and Harry and Yiddy on brains. Their connections to the Chicago outfit and New York's Genovese crime family began during Prohibition. One trial later revealed that they legally imported industrial-grade alcohol from Samuel Bronfman's distillery in Montreal, which was shipped across the Great Lakes to Duluth, then driven to the Twin Cities in souped-up Ford cars for processing at the Alop Pomer perfume factory. The Blumenfeld brothers also ran illegal distilleries in the woods near Fort Snelling. Historian Elaine Davis notes that, like many other mobsters from the Twin Cities, Chicago, and Kansas City, Kid Cann and his brothers often traveled to Stearns and Morrison counties to buy Minnesota 13, a high-quality moonshine made by Polish and German-American farmers. Local politicians and law enforcement were in on the scheme. Davis points out that the key contact between local moonshiners and organized crime was Chick Moeller, a resident of Melrose who lived with his family on a dairy farm near Big Birch Lake. The Blumenfelds had such a close business relationship with Moeller that they allegedly owned property south of the Rock Tavern in Melrose. According to Twin Cities crime reporter Paul McCabe, Kid Cann's rivalry with the Irish mob in Minneapolis ended when he and Irish mob bosses Big Ed Morgan and Tommy Banks settled their differences with a handshake dividing the city. Several deaths are attributed to Blumenfeld and his gang, including those of journalists who exposed his organization's operations and political connections. A Jewish restaurant owner from that era recalled that the Blumenfelds were idolized by generations of neighborhood boys. In the 1920s and 1930s, political and civil corruption ran rampant in the region. Mainstream newspapers rarely covered these issues, fearing retaliation. Any outlet that dared criticize the status quo was quickly silenced. Small tabloids tried to report the truth, but their reporters and editors became prime targets. For example, Howard Guilford of the Twin City Reporter was shot and killed on September 6, 1934. Sports journalist Sid Hartman, who grew up in a poor Russian Jewish family in North Minneapolis, was an 11-year-old newspaper boy when he was introduced to Kid Cann. Minneapolis Tribune circulation manager Joseph Katzman brought Hartman to Jack Doy's restaurant on Hennepin Avenue, where the upstairs hosted one of the largest sports betting operations in the city. Kid Cann, Tommy Banks, and the Berman brothers were regulars. This chance encounter sparked a decades-long friendship between Hartman and the city's underworld figures. The AZ Syndicate, which operated from their headquarters at the Flame Jazz Club in the Washington Avenue Gateway District, committed a variety of crimes. Hartman recalls Kid Cann bringing in top entertainers like Sophie Tucker and Cab Calloway to perform. After hours, the club closed its doors, and the real action began. On one occasion, police raided the club at 4 a.m. and took everyone to the paddy wagon. Hartman begged the cops not to book him, fearing it would cost him his job at the Tribune. They let him go. On August 23, 1933, a federal grand jury in Oklahoma City indicted Blumenfeld for laundering the $200,000 ransom that Machine Gun Kelly received after kidnapping oilman Charles Urschel. The money had been traced to Hennepin State Bank in Minneapolis. Kid Cann was arrested and transported to Oklahoma City to await trial. However, Minneapolis Police Chief Joseph Lem traveled there to testify on his behalf, and the charges were dropped in December 1933. Not long after, Conrad Alone, the AZ Syndicate's accountant and a secret informant for the IRS who reportedly knew where every penny and body was buried, was found shot to death with a Thompson submachine gun in a Dakota County cornfield. After Prohibition ended, Kid Cann and his family kept control of the now legal liquor industry, owning major liquor stores like East Hennepin Liquors and Lake Street Liquors. They dominated the business, making plenty of enemies along the way. An internal FBI memo stated that no one could operate in Minneapolis without first getting permission from the syndicate. If anyone tried to open a business without approval, the syndicate would quickly shut them down. The most infamous crime linked to Kid Cann was the murder of Walter Liggett, a founder of the Farmer Labor Party and editor of the Midwest American newspaper. Liggett had exposed connections between Twin Cities organized crime, led by the Blumenfeld brothers and senior politicians, including Minnesota Governor Floyd Olson. Starting in June 1935, Midwest American printed articles accusing Olson of corruption and ties to the syndicate. Liggett's reporting revealed that the syndicate controlled the liquor trade in Minneapolis after Prohibition. In September 1935, Midwest American published stories about Kid Cann's criminal history and his role in the liquor industry, pointing out how Cann's company, Chesapeake Brands Liquors, had shifted from perfume to liquor after Prohibition. Liggett even alleged that Cann's Lake Street Liquors had started advertising before the city council had approved their license. Liggett refused bribes and reported that prominent figures like Minneapolis Alderman Henry Banks and State Liquor Commissioner David Arundel attended a prize fight as Kid Cann's personal guests. According to historian Neil Carlin, Kid Cann believed Liggett was trying to extort him through these reports. He was particularly enraged that Liggett dared to expose Governor Olson's connections to the syndicate. Liggett was beaten, falsely prosecuted for rape, and finally, on December 9, 1935, shot dead in an alley behind his home. His wife, daughter, and several neighbors witnessed the assassination and identified Kid Cann as the shooter. Kid Cann was indicted, and his trial began on January 29, 1936, with the Hennepin County and State's Attorney's offices prosecuting. Meanwhile, his half-brother Jacob Blumenfeld, also known as Yiddy Bloom, surfaced in Paris, where he told the Washington Times that Liggett's murder was unfortunate, but that Liggett had made life difficult for the syndicate. Despite multiple witnesses, Kid Cann was acquitted due to poor investigative work and a sloppy trial. Edith Liggett, Walter's widow, always believed that Governor Olson and his fixer, Charles Ward, orchestrated her husband's murder because of his repeated accusations of organized crime ties. Though Kid Cann was charged in other serious crimes, such as the murder of cab driver Charles Goldberg and the attempted murder of Officer James Trepanier, which left him paralyzed, he continued to dodge conviction. According to crime historian Paul McCabe, FBI files revealed that Minneapolis Jewish mob boss David Berman contributed heavily to Marvin L. Klein's mayoral campaign, securing a deal that allowed Berman to control illegal gambling in the city. From 1941 to 1945, Berman briefly overtook the Blumenfelds and became the leader of the Minneapolis underworld. In 1942, FBI documents described Kid Cann as the recognized leader of graft and racketeering in Minneapolis, adding that he had corrupted city and county officials and harbored criminals. He even bragged about controlling the city council. These files also claimed he had been involved with Bugsy Siegel in running the El Cortez Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. By December 1944, anti-corruption crusader Arthur Cashman, editor of the Public Press, wrote a damning article labeling Klein's administration the most corrupt regime in the city's history. A month later, on January 22, 1945, Cashman was ambushed and shot dead on a sidewalk in Minneapolis. The murder shocked the city, but few were surprised when the investigation was quietly dropped. However, public outrage helped propel Hubert Humphrey to his first term as Minneapolis mayor, where he vowed to take down the rackets. Humphrey may have shut down David Berman's more obvious criminal activities, but Tommy Banks and the Blumenfeld brothers mostly escaped unscathed. Berman and his crew shifted their operations to Las Vegas, while the Blumenfelds tightened their grip on Minneapolis. According to journalists Neil Carlin and Bob Patron, the Blumenfeld brothers made multiple attempts to extort Frank Fitek, owner of the Swing City Club in St. Paul. After Fitek refused to pay protection money or hand over his club, he was abducted and left with 2 broken legs. Even after this brutal attack, Fitek refused to sell. In retaliation, his club was set on fire in November 1945. When that didn't work, Kid Cann allegedly had Fitek strangled to death on March 4, 1946, but no one was ever prosecuted for the murder. In the early 1950s, as Twin City Rapid Transit began dismantling its streetcar system in favor of diesel buses, Blumenfeld acquired a 16% stake in the company. He was later accused of teaming up with Fred Ossanna, a former Farmer Labor Party fixer turned corporate raider, to intimidate stockholders into selling. After their hostile takeover succeeded, both Blumenfeld and Ossanna reportedly received kickbacks from selling the scrap metal from the streetcars. By 1960, what was left of Twin City Rapid Transit had been taken over at the request of Governor Orville Freeman. In 1954, the Chicago Crime Commission named Kid Cann as being involved with the Chicago outfit in the jukebox racket. As public interest in organized crime grew throughout the 1950s, federal agents in the Twin Cities became more determined to put Blumenfeld and his associates behind bars. By the late 1950s, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, added Blumenfeld to their denaturalization and deportation program, aiming to send him back to Romania for moral corruption. Both the INS and FBI launched investigations into Kid Cann's sexual activities between 1959 and 1960. However, Sid Hartman, a close friend of Blumenfeld, believed that the federal government's pursuit of the AZ syndicate was fueled by anti-Semitism. In his memoir, Hartman wrote that while it was acceptable for the Kennedys and other wealthy Twin Cities families to profit from bootlegging, it infuriated many that Jewish figures were still running Minneapolis and thriving in the liquor business. In 1959, Kid Cann was indicted for violating the Mann Act by transporting Marilyn Toussaint, a Chicago prostitute, across state lines to work in his prostitution ring in the Twin Cities. Though his defense team read intimate letters from Toussaint to suggest her relationship with Kid Cann was more than just business, the court found him guilty, sentencing him to 2 years. While this conviction was being appealed, a federal grand jury indicted Kid Cann, Fred Ossanna, and 6 other executives of Twin City Rapid Transit for mail fraud, wire fraud, and transporting stolen property across state lines. Everyone except Blumenfeld was convicted. In another federal trial in 1960, the IRS used ownership records to show that Blumenfeld and his associates still controlled the Minneapolis liquor industry. Caught offering a $10,000 bribe to a juror, Blumenfeld was quickly charged with jury tampering. He pleaded guilty. FBI Special Agent Bill Lace, in an interview with Paul McCabe, recalled sitting with Blumenfeld while awaiting sentencing. Isidore lit my cigarette, took off my coat and called me sir, Lace said. Blumenfeld admitted to trying to bribe the juror and even offered to send Lace's wife a nice present, testing if he too could be bought. In 1961, after being charged with ordering rigged dice for his Twin City illegal gambling operations, blowing up a rival's house in Miami Beach, and taking a cut from the profits skimmed from Las Vegas's Sands Hotel and Casino through a frontman named Mr. Isaacs. Kid Cann was sentenced by federal judge Edward Liggett to a second 2-year term for attempted jury tampering. Upon his release, Kid Cann moved to Miami Beach, Florida, with his brothers. They kept making money through criminal activities, but shifted their focus to shady real estate deals instead of their previous operations. By 1967, Miami newspapers reported that Kid Cann, Lansky, and their relatives owned or had financial stakes in 10 of Miami's top hotels. Blumenfeld and Lansky were also accused of creating a maze of businesses, deeds, mortgages, leases, and lawsuits to hide their involvement and dodge federal taxes. According to Neil Carlin, Lansky once said of Blumenfeld, "I wouldn't trust that momser bastard with my pocket comb." Carlin adds that despite this, Lansky was fond of Blumenfeld's brothers, Harry and Edie, and couldn't say no to them. During a 1976 interview with a Minneapolis reporter, Kid Cann often visited his family and friends in Minnesota. Blumenfeld criticized the federal agents and prosecutors who had imprisoned him, calling them his persecutors and describing his conviction under the Mann Act as a baseless charge involving just $2. He also mentioned turning down an offer to write his memoirs, stating, "I have nothing to say really." However, in 1978, Blumenfeld and his brothers were allegedly involved in manipulating magic marker stock prices, according to Paul McCabe. After the death of the legendary Twin Cities figure Madam Nina Clifford in July 1929, the syndicate assigned Blumenfeld's girlfriend, Lillian Lee, to run Clifford's brothel at 147 and 145 South Washington Street in St. Paul. City directories confirmed that Lillian Lee, listed as a saleswoman, managed the brothel from 1931 to 1934. After living together for several years, Blumenfeld and Lillian Lee married on August 25, 1936. They had no children, and upon her death, Lillian Blumenfeld was buried beside her husband at Ada Yeshurun Cemetery in Edina. After reportedly returning home to pass away, Kid Cann died of heart disease at Minneapolis's Mount Sinai Hospital on June 21, 1981. His death made national headlines. At that time, Isidore Blumenfeld's estate was roughly valued at $10 million, according to a Time magazine obituary, which mistakenly listed his place of death as New York City. Kid Cann was also a philanthropist. Although Jewish, he donated about 10% of his $10 million fortune to both churches and synagogues. When asked why, Blumenfeld replied, "I believe in playing all the angles. I'm superstitious." Rabbi Max Shapiro of Temple Israel, the leading rabbi at the city's largest congregation and the most sought-after eulogist, led the graveside services in the rain before Blumenfeld's burial at Ada Yeshurun Cemetery in Edina, Minnesota. Nearby lies the grave of Charles Goldberg, a Minneapolis taxi driver whom Blumenfeld had shot dead in what was claimed to be an accidental shooting during an argument over a girl outside Café Vienna in 1924. In an on-site interview with Minneapolis Tribune reporter Bonnie Miller-Rubin, Harry Horowitz described Blumenfeld as a wonderful fellow. When someone needed something, he helped out. Many a person who was broke, who had absolutely nothing, he never forgot his friends, and he always kept the family together. Rabbi Shapiro later shared, "After Kid Cann's funeral, I received a call from someone who asked how I could officiate at the funeral of such a terrible human being. I answered, 'It's my belief that every Jew at death, no matter what he did in life, deserves to have the mourner's Kaddish, the last prayer said for him. So I said Kaddish for Kid Cann.' If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll stay up to date on all our latest videos.